Égalité. He supported the revolution, condemned to the guillotine. The air in Paris during the late 18th century did not smell of revolution yet. It smelled of stagnant water, expensive perfume, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood that had not yet been spilled. At the center of this world stood a man who possessed everything the old regime could offer, yet he was the one who would provide the match to light the fuse. Louis-Philippe II, the Duke of Orléans, walked through the halls of Versailles not as a loyal subject, but as a ghost haunting his own lineage. He was the cousin of the king, the wealthiest man in France, and a prince of the blood, yet his heart beat with a rhythm that was entirely alien to the gilded cages of the monarchy. He looked at the throne not with reverence, but with a calculated, simmering resentment. To understand the collapse of an empire, one must look not at the peasants in the streets, but at the man in the palace who decided that being a prince was no longer enough. He wanted to be a symbol. He wanted to be the future. He did not realize that the future he was building had no place for men of his birth. The Duke lived in a state of perpetual friction with the crown. While Louis XVI was a man of quiet indecision and mechanical hobbies, Orléans was a creature of the Enlightenment, a man of the salons, and a patron of the forbidden. He saw the cracks in the foundation of the Bourbon dynasty long before the stones began to fall. His residence, the Palais Royal, became a sovereign state within a state. It was a place where the king's police had no jurisdiction, a sanctuary for orators, gamblers, and revolutionaries. Beneath the elegant arches of his garden, the seeds of 1789 were planted in the minds of men who had nothing to lose, funded by a man who had everything. He opened his doors to the mob, not out of a sense of charity, but because he understood a fundamental truth of power. If you cannot lead the court, you must lead the street. He was reinventing himself in real time, shedding the skin of an aristocrat to reveal the scales of a populist. The tension between the Duke and the King was not merely political, it was deeply personal. A cold war fought with snubs and whispers. Orléans was banished from the court multiple times, sent to his estates like a child to his room. Each exile only deepened his conviction that the system was a rotting corpse. He spent his time in England, admiring their constitutional monarchy, their freedom of the press, and their pragmatic approach to wealth. He returned to France not just as a nobleman, but as an architect of dissent. He saw the hunger in the eyes of the Parisian people and recognized it as a tool. While the king remained sequestered in the vacuum of Versailles, the Duke was in the heart of the city, feeling the vibration of the coming earthquake. He was the bridge between the high-minded philosophy of the philosophers and the raw, desperate energy of the bread riots. He believed he could ride the storm, that he could use the chaos to wash away his enemies and leave him standing as the enlightened protector of a new France. As the 1780s drew to a close, the financial heart of France stopped beating. The debt was a mountain, the harvests were a tragedy, and the people were a powder keg. When the king finally called the Estates General in 1789, it was a confession of weakness. The Duke of Orléans did not enter the assembly as a defender of his class. He arrived as a disruptor. When the procession began, he did not walk with the princes of the blood. He walked with the Third Estate, the commoners, the lawyers, and the merchants. It was a calculated betrayal of his own bloodline, a visual declaration that the old hierarchies were dead. The silence that met his gesture was heavy with the weight of centuries. The nobility looked at him with horror, seeing a traitor. The commoners looked at him with suspicion, seeing a wolf in sheep's clothing. But for that moment, he was the hero of the hour. He was the prince who had chosen the people. The atmosphere in Paris became a thick, suffocating fog of paranoia and hope. The Duke's Palais Royal was the lungs of the city, breathing in the frustration of the masses and exhaling radical rhetoric. It was here that Camille Desmoulins would eventually jump onto a table and call the people to arms. The Duke provided the stage, the audience, and the protection. He watched from his windows as the crowds gathered, their voices rising in a discordant symphony of anger. He felt a sense of triumph. He believed he was the invisible hand guiding the hand of history. He did not see the irony that he was feeding a beast that would eventually develop a taste for his own name. To the Duke, the revolution was a chess game where he was the only player who understood the value of every piece. To the people, He was a temporary ally, a source of coin and cover, a man whose utility would expire the moment the first drop of royal blood touched the soil. The inciting incident of his ultimate downfall was not a single event, but a series of incremental surrenders. It began with the opening of the Estates General, but it solidified during the hot, desperate days of July. As the Bastille fell, the Duke was seen by many as the Shadow King, the man who could have stopped the madness but chose to let it burn. He was accused of orchestrating the riots, of paying agitators to stir the crowds. Whether true or not, the perception was his reality. He was no longer just a duke, he was a revolutionary icon. He began to distance himself from his titles, his heritage, and his past. He sought a new identity that would protect him from the very fires he had helped stoke. He became Philippe Égalité. The name was a mask, a desperate attempt to blend into the grey, violent landscape of the new republic. It was a name that stripped him of his history, but left him naked before the judgment of men who hated everything he represented. The transition from the Duke of Orléans to Philippe Égalité was a slow-motion collapse of a man's soul. He sat in the National Assembly, surrounded by men who looked at his fine clothes and saw a target. He spoke the language of the revolution, but his accent was still that of the palace. He voted for the measures that stripped the nobility of their privileges, effectively signing away his own birthright in the hope of buying another day of life. He was a man trapped in a paradox. To survive the revolution, he had to destroy the world that created him, but in destroying that world, he became a man without a country, a man without a tribe. The Jacobins watched him with cold, calculating eyes. To them, he was a curiosity, a relic that had managed to delay its own destruction by becoming a caricature of their ideals. They used his money, they used his influence, and they waited for the moment he would become a liability. The air grew colder as the revolution turned inward. The initial joy of liberty was replaced by the rigid, mechanical requirements of survival. The Duke, now Égalité, found himself in a position where every word was a gamble and every silence was a confession. He had abandoned his cousin, the king, believing that by distancing himself from the monarchy, he could escape its fate. He watched as the king was brought back from Varennes, a prisoner in his own kingdom. He saw the royal family trapped in the temple prison, and he felt a flicker of something he had long suppressed: fear. Not the fear of a political rival, but the primal fear of a man who realizes he has walked into a trap of his own making. He had built the guillotine in his mind, long before the first one was erected in the square. He had designed the logic of the terror by justifying the removal of anyone who stood in the way of the will of the people. The moment of no return arrived, when the question of the king's life was put to a vote. The National Convention was a theatre of shadows, where men were forced to choose between their conscience and their survival. Philippe Égalité stood before the assembly, the eyes of France fixed upon him. He was being asked to decide the fate of his own flesh and blood. To vote for life was to sign his own death warrant, to be labelled a royalist and a traitor to the Republic. To vote for death was to commit an act of regicide and fratricide that would echo through history. He stood at the podium, the weight of his name pressing down on his shoulders. The silence was absolute. In that moment, the Duke of Orléans died, and Philippe Égalité was born in the most brutal way possible. He spoke the words that would haunt his final days, voting for the death of Louis XVI. It was a choice made under the crushing pressure of a machine he had helped build, a machine that was now demanding a sacrifice to prove his loyalty. He thought the sacrifice would be the king. He did not realize that the machine was only just beginning to get hungry. The vote for death was not a climax, it was a trapdoor. When Philippe Égalité stepped down from the rostrum, the air in the chamber felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and new blood. He had just condemned his own cousin, the King of France, to the blade, thinking it would be his baptism into the new world. Instead, it was his funeral. The silence that followed his declaration of death was not one of respect, but of calculated assessment. The radicals in the room, men like Robespierre and Marat, did not see a comrade in that moment. They saw a man who would kill his own family to save his skin. If he would do that to a king, what would he do to them? Power does not reward loyalty when that loyalty is born of terror. It waits for the fear to become exhaustion. Philippe returned to his home, but the Palais Royal no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a cage. The tapestries seemed to weep, and the portraits of his ancestors looked at him with eyes that had already seen the end. He had traded his bloodline for a title that meant nothing in a world where titles were being burned. The revolution was no longer a fire he could warm his hands by. It was a blaze that was consuming the very oxygen he needed to breathe. Every morning, the sun rose over a city that felt increasingly alien. The streets he once owned now belonged to the shadows and the pikes. He had become a ghost in his own life, a prince who had unmade himself into a commoner, only to find that commoners were the ones most likely to die. The guillotine was no longer a distant rumor of justice. It was a rhythmic heartbeat pulse in the center of the city, a mechanical witness to the fact that no one, not even a man who votes for the death of a king, is ever truly safe. The political landscape of Paris began to shift like sand under a rising tide. The unity that had characterized the early days of the revolution fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. Philippe found himself caught between the Girondins, who sought a more moderate path, and the Mountain, the radical Jacobins who viewed moderation as a form of treason. For a man of his wealth and birth, there was no middle ground. He was a walking contradiction, a living relic of the very thing the Republic sought to erase. Every speech he gave in the convention was met with a wall of skepticism. His colleagues listened to his revolutionary rhetoric and heard only the echoes of the palace. They watched his hands as he gestured, looking for the phantom weight of a ring he no longer wore. The wealth that had once bought him influence now bought him only suspicion. He began to realize that he was being used as a shield. As long as he was there, voting as he was told, he provided a shred of legitimacy to the radicals. But shields are discarded once the battle becomes too intense. He watched as his former allies were dragged to the revolutionary tribunal, their faces pale under the flickering torches. He saw the way the law was being rewritten, not to protect the innocent, but to streamline the path to the scaffold. The law of suspects made the very act of existing a potential crime. For Philippe, existence was already a provocation. He had tried to outrun his past by changing his name, but the past has a way of catching up in the dark. He spent his nights in a state of high-alert paralysis, listening to the sound of carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside, wondering if this was the night the knock would come. Inside his mind, the walls were closing in. Philippe began to experience the psychological disintegration that comes from living a lie for too long. He had convinced himself that his betrayal of the king was a necessity, a sacrifice for the greater good of France. But in the quiet hours, when the wine could no longer dull the edge of his thoughts, he saw the face of Louis XVI. He remembered their childhood, the shared history of a family that had ruled for centuries. He had broken a sacred bond, not for a principle, but for a chance to belong to a future that clearly did not want him. The monologues of his conscience were a cacophony of regret and justification. He told himself that he was a patriot, that the monarchy had to die so the nation could live. But the nation was currently starving, screaming, and tearing itself apart. The equality he had championed was proving to be a leveling down to the grave. He felt the isolation of a man who had burned every bridge behind him, only to find the shore he had reached was a barren rock. He was the most hated man in France. The royalists in exile viewed him as a monster, a Judas who had sold his king for a seat in a crumbling assembly. The revolutionaries viewed him as a parasite, a man who had only joined them to save his head. There was no one left to trust. His children were his only tether to reality, particularly his eldest son, the Duke of Chartres. He pinned his hopes on the boy's military career, believing that if his son could win glory for the Republic on the battlefield, the father might be forgiven for his birth. It was a desperate, fragile hope, the kind that men cling to when they know the water is already above their chins. The turning point came not from a decree or a riot, but from a letter. News arrived from the front lines that changed the chemistry of his survival. His son, the Duke of Chartres, had become disillusioned with the radicalization of the government. Under the influence of General Dumouriez, the young man had done the unthinkable. He had defected to the enemy. They had crossed the lines to join the Austrians, the very army that was marching toward Paris to restore the old order. In the eyes of the Committee of Public Safety, this was not just a military failure. It was a dynastic plot. The sins of the son were immediately visited upon the father. The fragile protection Philippe had enjoyed evaporated in an instant. He was no longer a citizen prince. He was the patriarch of a nest of traitors. The news hit the convention like a thunderclap. Philippe sat in his seat, feeling the eyes of the entire room boring into him. He tried to speak, to denounce his son, to declare his own innocence, but the words died in his throat. He realized that the logic of the revolution had finally caught up to him. He had spent years arguing that bloodlines mattered more than individuals, that the sins of the Bourbons were inherent in their very DNA. Now that same logic was being used to seal his fate. If his son was a traitor, then the blood that flowed in Philippe's veins was also tainted. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. He had helped create a world where guilt was hereditary, and now he was the primary victim of his own philosophy. The arrest was a quiet, almost bureaucratic affair. There was no grand confrontation, no heroic stand. The men who came for him were the same men who had once bowed to him in the gardens of the Palais Royal. They served the warrant with a mechanical indifference that was more terrifying than anger. As they led him away, he looked back at his home one last time. The mirrors that had reflected the most beautiful women and the most powerful men in Europe now reflected only a tired, middle-aged man in a rumpled coat. He was stripped of his belongings, his papers, and his identity. He was taken to the conciergerie, the antechamber of the guillotine. The transition from the salon to the cell was a descent into a different kind of reality. The walls were damp, the air was stagnant, and the only sound was the distant tolling of bells and the shuffling of feet in the corridor. He was surrounded by the very people he had helped to send here. The aristocrats he had betrayed looked at him with silent, cold contempt. They did not welcome him as a fellow victim. They watched him as if he were a poisonous insect trapped in the same jar. He was forced to confront the ultimate consequence of his choices. He had tried to navigate the revolution by being everyone and no one, and now he was truly nothing. He sat on a straw mattress, listening to the rats in the walls, and realized that the machine of power does not care about intentions. It only cares about the momentum of the moment. He had been a driver of that momentum, and now he was merely debris in its path. The turning point was complete. The architect of the revolution's early days had been discarded by the structure he helped build. He was no longer Philippe Égalité, the revolutionary hero. He was just a man waiting for his turn to speak to the blade. The stone walls of the conciergerie do not just hold bodies. They absorb the echoes of the souls that passed through them, creating a heavy, suffocating silence that tastes of salt and iron. For Philippe, the man who had traded a crown for a revolutionary cap, the darkness of his cell was a mirror. He sat on a bench that had likely held a dozen men before him, men who had all shared the same destination. The obstacle was no longer a political rival or a public scandal. The obstacle was the very clock on the wall. Time had become a physical weight, pressing against his chest. Outside, the city of Paris continued its frantic, bloody dance, but inside the prison, the world had narrowed to the width of a corridor and the height of a barred window. The Republic, the mistress he had courted with his wealth and his honor, had turned her face away. He was no longer a citizen. He was a clerical error waiting to be corrected. The difficulty was not just the impending trial, but the realization that his entire identity had been dissolved. In the eyes of the jailers, he was not the Duke of Orléans, nor was he the revolutionary Philippe Égalité. He was merely a number in a ledger, a piece of meat to be processed by the bureaucratic machinery of the terror. The trial was a theater of the absurd, a performance where the script had been written months in advance. As he was led into the courtroom of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the atmosphere was not one of justice, but of a harvest. The benches were filled with the tricotiuses, the women who knitted as they watched the heads fall, their needles clicking in a rhythmic, terrifying counterpoint to the proceedings. The judges sat beneath a bust of Brutus, their faces masks of ideological purity that hid a deep personal fear. To show mercy was to invite suspicion. To be a judge was to be a potential victim. Philippe looked at the jury and recognized the faces of men who had once begged for his patronage. Now they would not meet his eye. The accusations were a chaotic tapestry of contradictions. He was accused of conspiring with the monarchy he helped destroy and of plotting with the radicals he was now being purged by. The evidence did not matter. In the logic of 1793, the accusation was the proof. He stood in the dock listening to the prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, weave a narrative of betrayal that was both brilliant and entirely false. He realized then that he was being killed not for what he had done but for what he was. He was the living embodiment of the old world's sins, and his blood was needed to wash away the collective guilt of a nation that had gone mad with its own liberation. Deep within the silence of his mind, a different trial was taking place. Philippe was forced to confront the ghost of the man he had been. He thought of the vote he had cast against Louis XVI. He remembered the way the king had looked toward the gallery, perhaps searching for a friendly face, only to find the cold, determined gaze of his own cousin. Philippe had told himself it was a move of political genius, a way to anchor himself to the new order. Now, in the cold light of his own impending death, he saw it for what it was, a desperate, cowardly act of self-preservation that had achieved the opposite of its intent. He had thought that by sacrificing the king, he could buy his own life. But the revolution did not want a bargain. It wanted a total eclipse of the past. He felt a profound, aching sense of loss, not for his wealth or his titles, but for the integrity he had traded for a few extra months of breathing. The internal monologue was a relentless interrogation. "Who are you?" he asked the shadows. "You are a man who betrayed his family for a crowd that hates you. You are a man who funded a fire that is now burning your own house." The psychological collapse was absolute. He realized that the equality he had sought was not a shared prosperity, but a shared grave. The name he had taken, Égalité, was a cruel joke. He had achieved equality with the thousands of others who had been ground into the dust by the very wheels he had helped grease. The situation worsened as the isolation began to eat at his reason. He was denied visitors, denied news, denied the basic dignity of a private space. He was watched at all hours, a specimen in a jar. The other prisoners, those who still clung to the remnants of their aristocratic poise, treated him with a coldness that was sharper than any blade. He was the pariah among the condemned. In the evenings they would gather to perform mock trials, a grim rehearsal for the inevitable. They would mimic the judges, the witnesses, and the executioner. When it was Philippe's turn to play the victim in their games, the mockery was laced with a genuine visceral hatred. They blamed him for their predicament. They saw him as the architect of their ruin, the man who had opened the gates for the wolves and was now surprised to find himself being eaten. He endured their insults with a strange, numb stoicness. He had moved past the point of anger. He was in a state of existential exhaustion, a man who had seen the bottom of the abyss and realized there was nothing there but more darkness. He spent hours tracing the cracks in the cell floor, finding a strange comfort in the permanence of the stone compared to the fragility of human power. Then came the turning point, the moment when the last shred of his political identity was stripped away. A new decree was passed, one that formalized the end of all distinctions, even in death. It was announced that the Duke of Orléans would be executed under his revolutionary name, Philippe Égalité, but that his remains would be treated with the same anonymity as any common criminal. There would be no family plot, no marker, no memory. This news, delivered by a bored guard, did something to Philippe that the trial and the isolation had failed to do. It broke the last tether of his ego. He realized that the name he had adopted as a shield had become his shroud. He had spent his life trying to control the narrative of his existence, and now the revolution was erasing him entirely. He would not even be remembered as a villain or a traitor. He would be a footnote in a list of names read out in a crowded square. This realization brought with it a sudden, chilling clarity. He stopped arguing with his fate. He stopped preparing his defense. He understood that the machine did not need his cooperation to function. It only needed his presence. He began to prepare for the end, with a cold aristocratic detachment that he had not shown in years. This shift in perspective changed the way he occupied his space. He stopped slouching on the bench and began to stand with the posture of the prince he had once been. If he was to be an actor in this final scene, He would play the part with a dignity that would deny the mob the satisfaction of his fear. He requested a final meal, not of bread and water, but of the finest things the prison could provide. He sat in his cell, eating oysters and drinking white wine, a surreal image of luxury in a tomb. He was no longer trying to be a man of the people. He was a man who had played a high-stakes game and lost, and he would pay the debt with the composure of a professional. The turning point was his acceptance of the ultimate irony. The revolution had indeed made everyone equal, but only in the moment the blade touched the neck. In that realization, he found a perverse kind of peace. The paranoia that had defined his life for years vanished, replaced by a crystalline focus on the immediate. The sound of the tumbril in the courtyard was no longer a source of terror. It was a signal that the performance was almost over. He looked at his hands, once used to sign decrees and count gold, and saw that they were steady. He had finally found the one thing the revolution could not take from him, the right to choose how he would face the end of his own story. The atmosphere in the conciergerie shifted as the day of his execution approached. Even the guards, hardened by months of daily slaughter, noticed the change in the prisoner. There was no more pleading, no more frantic letters to the committee. Philippe moved through the rituals of the condemned with a terrifying silence. He allowed his hair to be cut, the cold steel of the scissors grazing his neck in a dress rehearsal for the heavier steel to come. He did not flinch when his collar was torn away to expose his throat. He was already elsewhere, his mind hovering over the city he had once thought he could rule. He saw the rooftops of the Palais Royal and felt a strange, detached pity for the man who had lived there. That man had been a fool, chasing a shadow he called power. The real power, Philippe now understood, was not in the ability to command others, but in the ability to command oneself at the threshold of the void. As he was led toward the gate where the carts waited, he passed a mirror in the warden's office. For the first time in months he saw himself clearly. He did not see a revolutionary or a duke. He saw a man who was about to be freed from the burden of his own ambition. The turning point was complete. He stepped out into the grey light of a Parisian morning, the sound of the crowd rising like the roar of an approaching sea, ready to meet the character that had been waiting for him since the very first day of the revolution, the silent, inevitable guillotine. 4. The wood of the tumbril groaned under the weight of a man who had once owned the ground beneath its wheels. Philippe sat upright, his back refusing to bend to the vibrations of the cobblestones. He wore a coat of green silk, a final act of defiance against the grey uniformity of the Republic. The crowd was a wall of noise, a tidal wave of insults that crashed against the sides of the cart. He did not look at them. He looked through them, toward the horizon where the wooden frame of the guillotine stood like a skeletal finger, pointing at the sky. The air was biting, a cold November wind that carried the scent of the river and the rot of the city. He felt the eyes of the people on him, 1,000 gazes that had once been lowered in respect, but were now sharpened by the thrill of his descent. He was the ultimate entertainment, the prince who had become a regicide, the revolutionary who had become a traitor. He was the living proof that in the forge of a revolution there is no such thing as an ally, only a temporary reprieve from the heat. Every jolt of the cart was a reminder that his journey was short, and the destination was the only thing in France that remained certain. The procession took a deliberate, agonizing route. The authorities had planned the path to maximize the humiliation, ensuring that the man who had styled himself the champion of the people would be seen by those same people in his moment of absolute vulnerability. The cart paused in front of the Palais Royal. This was the moment of maximum tension, a psychological blow designed to crush whatever remained of his spirit. He looked up at the windows of his former home, the place where he had plotted, where he had feasted, and where he had opened the gates of his gardens to the radical orators who would eventually sign his death warrant. The palace looked cold and hollow, a monument to a life that had been liquidated by the very forces it had unleashed. He saw the balconies where he had stood to receive the cheers of the mob. Now those same balconies were empty, and the mob was at his feet, screaming for his blood. He realized in that agonizing pause that he had not been the master of the revolution. He had been its fuel. He had burned through his wealth, his reputation, and his family to keep the fire going, and now that the fuel was spent, the fire was simply moving on to the next source. The journey continued toward the Place de la Révolution. As the cart reached the square, the guillotine came into full focus. It was not the towering monster of legend, but a strangely compact, efficient-looking machine. It stood on a high platform, painted a dull red that was nearly the color of dried blood. The blade, suspended at the top of the frame, caught the pale light of the afternoon sun. It was a clean, sharp glint in an otherwise murky world. The crowd in the square was denser than in the streets, a sea of faces that stretched to the edges of the buildings. There was a strange vibration in the air, a mixture of bloodlust and a terrifying collective silence. Philippe looked at the platform and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This was the equality he had spoken of. This was the final, brutal leveling of society. The blade did not care if the neck it severed belonged to a king, a peasant, or a prince of the blood. It was the only truly democratic institution in France, a mechanical judge that delivered its verdict with a single, swift motion. He was led from the cart to the base of the steps. His legs were heavy, but they did not fail him. He climbed the wooden stairs with a steady, rhythmic pace, each step echoing in the silence of the square. When he reached the platform, he was met by Sanson, the executioner. The man moved with a professional indifference that was more chilling than any expression of hatred. He was a technician of death, a bureaucrat of the scaffold. He reached out to help Philippe remove his green silk coat, but the former duke pulled away. He would do it himself. He stripped off the coat and threw it aside, standing in his shirt sleeves against the cold. One of the assistants moved to take off his boots, but Philippe stopped him. He told the man that the boots would come off easier after he was dead. It was a flash of the old wit, a moment of dark humor that served as his final armor. He was no longer trying to survive. He was trying to finish his part with the dignity that his life had often lacked. The moment of the fall was a mechanical sequence. He was strapped to the board, the wood cold against his chest. He felt the movement as the plank was swung into a horizontal position, sliding his neck into the lunette. The world narrowed to the view of the basket below, and the grain of the wood inches from his eyes. He felt the shadow of the blade above him, a presence that felt almost sentient. In those final seconds, the noise of the crowd seemed to vanish, replaced by the sound of his own breath. He thought of his son, safe in the arms of the enemy, and he hoped the boy would never come back to this land of ghosts and iron. He thought of the king, his cousin, and for a heartbeat, the weight of his vote felt heavier than the blade. Then there was a sharp, metallic click as the lever was pulled. The descent was a blur of silver. There was no pain, only a sudden, absolute transition from the noise of existence to the silence of history. The crowd did not cheer immediately. There was a brief, heavy pause as the head fell into the basket and the body was moved aside to make room for the next. The machinery of the Republic continued to function, indifferent to the identity of the person it had just erased. Philippe Égalité was gone, but the revolution was still hungry. His death changed nothing in the grand trajectory of the terror, yet it revealed everything about the nature of power. He was a man who believed he could bargain with chaos, who thought that by sacrificing his principles, he could secure his safety. He had played a game where the rules were rewritten by the winners every hour, and he had failed to realize that the ultimate prize was not power, but survival. His life was a testament to the fact that when you feed a monster to keep it from your door, it only grows strong enough to break the door down. What remains of Philippe is a warning that echoes through the centuries. He was not a villain in the traditional sense, nor was he a hero. He was a man of immense privilege, who became convinced that he could outrun his own shadow. He believed that by becoming a symbol of equality, he could escape the judgment of the very system he helped create. But the revolution is a machine that does not recognize symbols. It only recognizes targets. His story forces us to look at our own choices in times of upheaval. What would you have done in his position? Would you have stayed silent as the world turned to violence, hoping the storm would pass over your house? Would you have joined the mob to ensure you weren't its next victim? At what point does the act of survival become the act of complicity? Philippe thought he was making a strategic choice when he voted for the king's death, but he was actually signing his own name on the next line of the ledger. History does not execute only the tyrants or the enemies of progress. It executes the people who believe they are safe because they have checked the right boxes and spoken the right slogans. It executes the people who think they can control the direction of a collapse. Philippe Égalité died because he thought he was a player in a game, only to realize at the very end that he was the stakes. His death reveals the cold reality that power is not a possession, but a temporary loan, and the interest is paid in blood. The guillotine stands as a silent witness to this truth, watching as each generation tries to reinvent the concept of justice, only to find that the blade is always waiting for those who think they are above the consequences of their own beliefs. The prince who died as a commoner left nothing behind but a name that became a synonym for the ultimate irony of the revolutionary promise. He sought equality, and finally, beneath the steel of the blade, he found it.